Okay, so I'm Martha Dowsley. These are my colleagues, Suzanne Mills and Emilie Cameron. So we've been looking at the cross-cutting theme of gender. We've completed a gap analysis, and we recently submitted an application for ReSDA funding to do a pilot study. So in our gap analysis, we examined gender from three perspectives: economic patterns of wealth distribution, the social, cultural, and political perspectives. As you can imagine, social cultural is the best documented. We've been hearing some of the concerns there with Gertrude's work. In the economic perspective, we've also touched on that a little bit from some of the other projects. Women are much less likely to work in the resource sector in general, much less likely to engage in remote site labor, often because of family commitments. There's concern about whether IBAs can include gender and how they should do that in different types of agreements, and how cash transfer mechanisms might be used to try to ameliorate some of the gender disparity issues. So in terms of gaps for that, we think that the use of cash transfers in different ways, negotiated agreements, might be really interesting to look at, because there's been some different successful and somewhat successful models, like having, for example, a men's and women's fund set up as part of an IBA, or types of projects that a certain fund could be used for, like sustainable development in the community or training in the community, that sort of thing, and how they're differently accessed by gender. So that's an interesting gap that we found that might be useful to move forward and try to help in terms of best practices. In terms of social cultural perspectives, we found different scales of issues, individual health effects, such as alcohol and drugs, jealousies, family breakdown. Interestingly, women have much higher rates of gambling addiction, whereas men are more likely to abuse alcohol and drugs when they're involved with increased income from remote site labor or fly-in, fly-out opportunities. And then there's family and community effects that are even more widespread, so a different scale, like the stress for single parenting, family separation, but as well as things like not participating in your roles and responsibility in your community, such as participating, say, in subsistence activity, providing your extended family with meat, for example, working with your spouse to do harvesting. And so there's ramifications from those that have effect just not on the nuclear family, but on the community, extended family, social, spiritual, and cultural impacts as well. So we're interested in finding out more ways to ameliorate the effects of employment on those type of social relations. And then our third perspective, resource and governance perspective, we found that women are often absent from the decision-making bodies. For example, hunters and trappers associations are often involved in negotiations for environmental assessment, and usually women are not very involved in those type of organizations. However, women are often on a lot of committees within the community, like the alcohol committee, school committee, that sort of thing. But women are not as often in elected positions, so they're not as often in negotiations for things like benefits to the community. So that's another major gap that we found, research on women's roles in those committees. I'll pass it over to Suzanne.
Okay, so basically, as far as the literature on gender relations in resource development and how this ties into our proposal that we submitted to ReSDA, some of the key things that we found missing from the literature was, first, we found that there wasn't much literature on gender and environmental assessment processes and impact benefit agreement processes. So that was one area, the regulatory framework around resource development. The other thing is that most of the literature doesn't look at gender relations. It focuses on women. And so we're really interested in looking at gender from a much broader perspective, looking at forms of masculinity. How is masculinity changing? What are the dynamics between women and men? How is that being reshaped with resource development in communities? Another thing that we felt was lacking was that when there is resource development, it's not just looking at the economic activity that's coming in from the resource development, but it's looking at how that is integrated with the broader social economy and traditional economies, and how is that shifting, and how is that interrelated with gender relations. So it's looking at it from a more complex perspective. the interrelation between traditional economies, gender roles in these economies, and how that's shifting when we see resource development. So those are the main gaps, and Emily's going to talk to you about how we'll address them in our proposal. Oh, I want to see the two people who we have mentioned. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess our project really did grow out of the gap analysis, and Martha and Suzanne and I and Deborah Simmons with the Satu Renewable Resources Board and University of Manitoba, as well as Rauna Kuokanen at University of Toronto, a Sami scholar. The five of us, some of the things we thought we wanted to pick up on from the gap analysis is there was also a need for more comparative synthetic work. There's a lot of case study work, but we thought we would try to pick up on this need for comparative synthetic information and undertake a project in 3 different regions. The Satu region, Nunavut, and we haven't yet determined whether that will be the Kitikmeot region or the Qikiqtani region, and Nunatsiavut. And so we chose 3 land claim regions, partly because of their similarities and their interesting differences around history and governance structures and experiences with resource development. So what we're proposing to do is, first of all, undertake a kind of a mapping of institutions that are even involved in resource development and specifically might have a gender responsibility or stake in resource development at the level of decision-making, implementation, and monitoring. So map out the institutions that are involved and then analyze those institutions and their policies in terms of gender. So attempt to sort of characterize what's going on right now in terms of gender, both officially and more broadly around gender relations. And then present the results of that initial analysis in each community in multi-day focus groups that is partly the way in which we've begun to conceptualize these, is that it will be a way of sharing information at an early stage and going on to discuss women's understandings of gender in each region, their experiences with the gender dimensions of resource development, to identify research and policy goals, and then to identify needed tools and materials. So we propose that in the next phase of this project, we would actually work together with our community partners to develop a kind of a toolkit of materials or tools to be determined based on each region's needs around gender and gender decision-making and resource development. We're in conversation with community partners in each of the regions, and so we do anticipate that the scope and methods might change a bit in each region. We're trying to balance this interest in doing something comparative and synthetic, but also with needing to attend to the specific priorities and interests of regions. So there will be some change in methodology and scope, we anticipate, but we do know that community researchers will be hired in each region to assist in this focus group design and coordination, to assist in methodological development and analysis of findings. And then, yeah, what I skipped over was our purpose. This is what happens when you don't have PowerPoint. Well, maybe I should actually take a step back and say that, you know, the gap analysis did identify that there's relatively little work on gender and gender relations. We felt that it was important that gender not just be a side piece of a bunch of projects, but that it be examined kind of in depth in its own right, but also that it's important not to import Southern and especially white middle class understandings of gender to these studies. And so we have ongoing discussions with our partners around that. And the purpose is to, first of all, determine how existing policies and institutions are gendered. So that's part of this mapping and policy analysis piece of the project. Second, to understand how changing employment patterns influence gender relations, especially around not just looking at how mine work influences gender relations, but understanding gender as embedded in a broader social and political context. And third, to help identify and produce relevant tools and materials for use in northern regions to address gender in decision-making, monitoring, and implementation. Did I miss anything? Okay.